In 1978, the average Chinese citizen earned less than the average sub-Saharan African, not slightly less. A Chinese farmer lived on roughly $155 a year. By 2023, China had the second largest economy on Earth. Most people think this happened because of communism, central planning, an all-powerful state directing resources like chess pieces. That is completely wrong. China got rich by secretly becoming capitalist while loudly pretending to stay communist. And the man who started it didn't have a plan. He had a guess. Here's what nobody tells you. The spark that ignited the greatest economic transformation in human history was 18 farmers in a starving village who signed a secret document one night in 1978, knowing it might get them executed. The document changed everything. Xiaoping Village, Anhui Province, December 1978. The village is dying. Not metaphorically, literally dying. Years of collectivized farming under Mao's commune system had reduced this community to a state of permanent famine. Farmers who once owned their land had been forced to work collective fields, with the state taking the harvest and redistributing according to quota. The result was predictable. Nobody had any incentive to produce. Why work harder if the state takes everything equally? Grain output had collapsed. By 1978, the 115 people of Xiaoping were surviving on tree bark and wild grass. Children were starving. Adults were walking miles to neighboring villages, begging. Then 18 farmers did something that, in Mao's China, could have gotten them shot. They gathered in a mud house one winter night. They split the collective land into private plots, one per family. They agreed that each family would keep what they grew above the state quota. And because they knew what they were doing was illegal, they signed a secret contract. The contract included a clause that said if any of them were arrested, the others would raise their children until adulthood. They were signing a death pact, just to be allowed to farm their own land. What happened the next harvest was, by every account, shocking. Grain output from Xiaoping's newly private plots exceeded the village's total output from the previous 5 collective years combined. In a single growing season, the local Communist Party official, a man named Chen Easy, discovered what had happened. He had 2 choices: report them and have them arrested, or look the other way. He looked the other way. Then he sent a quiet report up the chain. This is where the story gets strange. Deng Xiaoping, the new paramount leader of China, heard about Xiaoping, and instead of crushing it, he pointed to it. He called it an experiment. He told party officials to watch and see. By 1983, the household responsibility system, the Xiaoping model, had been extended to 98% of China's rural population. 700 million farmers now had incentive to produce. Agricultural output exploded. China went from chronic food shortage to grain surplus in less than a decade. The man who ended Chinese famine wasn't a visionary with a master plan. He was a pragmatist who saw something working and refused to stop it. Deng Xiaoping's famous phrase, "Cross the river by feeling the stones," not knowing where you're going, testing each foothold, staying alive long enough to reach the other bank. Now here's the number that should stop you cold. Between 1978 and 2018, China lifted approximately 800 million people out of extreme poverty. Let that sit there for a second. 800 million people. The entire population of sub-Saharan Africa today is roughly at 1.2 billion. China moved the equivalent of 2/3 of that continent's population across the poverty line in 40 years. The World Bank has called this the fastest sustained reduction in poverty in human history. There is no close second. There is no historical parallel. Nothing even rhymes with it. To understand how incomprehensible this is, consider the comparison points. Britain's Industrial Revolution, the event every economics textbook uses as the benchmark of rapid transformation, took roughly 100 years to meaningfully raise living standards for the mass population. And even then, the early decades of British industrialization produced enormous human suffering. Children in coal mines. Life expectancy in Manchester in 1841 was 28 years. The United States went from an agricultural economy to an industrial powerhouse over roughly 60 years of post-Civil War growth. China did something structurally comparable but at 10 times the scale in half the time. China's GDP per capita in 1978, approximately $155 in current dollars. China's GDP per capita in 2023, approximately $12,720. That is an 80-fold increase in real living standards within a single lifetime. Here's the analogy that captures it best. Imagine you're watching a time-lapse of a city being built. Normal cities in time-lapse look fast. China's growth isn't a city in time-lapse. It's a civilization being constructed at the speed of a film's special effect. Cities of 10 million people appearing where there were fishing villages 30 years ago. Not one city, dozens. Shenzhen in 1979 was a fishing town of 30,000 people on the border with Hong Kong. Today it has 18 million residents and produces more patents annually than most European countries. But here's where the conventional story starts to crack. Because if you tell people China got rich through central planning and communist discipline, you're telling them a comfortable lie. The actual mechanism was something far more contradictory, far more interesting, and far more disturbing to anyone who thinks ideology determines destiny. What were the special economic zones, really? Deng Xiaoping's team needed a way to inject capitalism into a communist system without admitting they were doing it. The solution they arrived at was essentially geographic. You designate certain areas as economically special. Inside those zones, foreign investment is welcomed, markets are allowed to function, private enterprise is encouraged, and the ideological rules that apply everywhere else are quietly suspended. The Beijing framing was careful. These weren't capitalist enclaves, they were socialist market experiments, a phrase so deliberately vague it was almost satirical. Shenzhen was the first and most important. In 1980, it was designated a special economic zone. Foreign companies poured in, Hong Kong manufacturers relocated across the border, factories appeared almost overnight. Young workers from rural provinces arrived in their millions, chasing wages that were 5 or 10 times what farming could provide. Ronald Coase, the Nobel Prize-winning economist who co-authored How China Became Capitalist, made an observation that should permanently change how you think about economic ideology. He noted that China's market transformation was largely driven not by the party's design, but by what he called marginal revolutions. Experiments happening at the edges, below the radar, started by ordinary people desperate to survive. The party didn't design the Zedong experiment. Farmers did it secretly to avoid starvation. The party didn't design the township and village enterprises, the semi-private rural manufacturing firms that emerged in the 1980s. Local officials created them in a regulatory gray zone, calling them collective enterprises, while running them like private businesses, precisely because genuine private ownership was still legally ambiguous. The economists Arthur Kroeber and Yisheng Huang have both documented the fundamental tension at the heart of China's growth story. Kroeber argues the state was a surprisingly effective coordinator of industrial policy. Huang's research, particularly in capitalism with Chinese characteristics, argues almost the opposite, that China's early growth was actually driven by private rural entrepreneurship, and that the period of heaviest state involvement in the 1990s and 2000s came with significant efficiency costs, particularly for rural populations. Both are right about different things, and that tension is the point. China's miracle wasn't clean, it wasn't ideologically consistent, it wasn't the triumph of communism or the triumph of capitalism. It was something messier and more human. A series of desperate improvisations that happened to compound into the greatest economic expansion in recorded history. Here is the piece of the China story that gets systematically underreported in Western media and systematically suppressed in Chinese state media. China's economic miracle created inequality on a scale that would make Gilded Age America look moderate. In 1981, China's Gini coefficient, the standard measure of income inequality where 0 is perfect equality and 1 is perfect inequality, was approximately 0.28. Lower than the United States, lower than most developed economies. By 2010, it had reached 0.49, higher than the United States, higher than most developed economies. The World Bank's poverty data tells one story, hundreds of millions lifted from destitution, but hidden inside that story is another one. The gap between those who benefited most and those left behind became one of the widest in the world. The hukou system is central to understanding why. China's internal passport system, the hukou, ties citizens' access to public services, schools, hospitals, social welfare, to their place of birth registration. A farmer from Sichuan who moves to Shenzhen to work in a factory is not legally a resident of Shenzhen. Their children cannot attend local schools without paying steep fees. They have no access to the city's social insurance. They are, in the language of Chinese official statistics, a floating population. At peak periods, this floating population numbered over 280 million people, the largest internal migration in human history, producing a class of workers who built the cities but couldn't fully live in them. The coastal cities that absorbed this labor grew wealthy. Interior rural provinces were drained of their working-age population and remained comparatively poor. The rural-urban income gap, by some measures, reached a ratio of 3.3 to 1 by the mid-2000s. Joshua Cooper Ramo coined the term Beijing consensus in 2004, partly to contrast with the Washington consensus of liberal markets and democratic institutions. The Beijing consensus, roughly stated, held that authoritarian development could produce rapid growth outcomes that democratic systems, with their inefficiencies and political constraints, could not match. The argument has genuine empirical force. China did grow faster than any democratic economy in the same period. The infrastructure China built in 20 years would have taken democratic systems a century of political negotiation. But Ramo's framing obscures a cost that doesn't appear in GDP statistics. When the party decided, in the late 1980s and 1990s, to restructure state-owned enterprises, approximately 45 million urban workers lost their jobs in a decade. The party called it optimizing. Those workers who had been promised lifetime employment by the socialist state experienced it as betrayal. Their pensions were underfunded or non-existent. Their housing, which had been tied to their factory work, was privatized in ways that benefited connected insiders rather than long-time residents. The people who got rich during China's transformation were disproportionately those with party connections, geographic proximity to the coast, or the education and mobility to chase opportunities. The people who got left behind were disproportionately rural, elderly, or located in the interior provinces far from the export economy. This is not a critique that China's growth wasn't real, it was spectacularly real. It is a recognition that the distribution of that growth was profoundly uneven in ways the official poverty statistics don't fully capture. So what do we actually learn from China? The comfortable lessons, the ones that get written into policy papers and development economics textbooks, tend to go like this. Open markets, let prices function, create export zones, invest in infrastructure. The China model distilled into transferable principles. But the uncomfortable truth, the one that breaks the neat models, is this. China's growth didn't follow any existing theoretical framework precisely. It confounded both the Washington Consensus and the Beijing Consensus. It confounded the IMF economists who predicted crisis after crisis that didn't materialize. It confounded the democratic development theorists who argued that political liberalization was a precondition for sustained economic growth. The Penworld tables, the gold standard of historical GDP comparison data, show China's total factor productivity, the efficiency of its entire economic output, actually growing slower than many analysts expected, even during the highest growth decades. The sheer scale of capital investment, the factories, the infrastructure, the urban construction, was doing more work than pure efficiency gains. Put simply, China built its way out of poverty at a speed and scale that flooded efficiency calculations. They deployed capital at a volume that brute-forced economic transformation in a way no existing model had anticipated. Here's the analogy. Economic theory says you don't win a race by running inefficiently. China's response was essentially to enter the race with 10 times more runners than anyone else. Individually, each runner might not be the fastest. Collectively, they covered the ground. The OECD's economic surveys of China repeatedly noted the paradox. Productivity metrics suggested an economy that should be growing at 5 to 6%. Yet, China was regularly posting 9 to 10%. The gap was explained by the sheer volume of resources being mobilized. An investment rate is a share of GDP that regularly exceeded 40%, double or triple the level seen in other economies. But here's the dark edge of that observation. Investment-led growth at that scale only works if the investments are productive. And the evidence from the 2000s and 10s onward is that an increasing proportion of Chinese infrastructure investment was producing diminishing returns. Ghost cities, fully constructed urban areas with no residents, became a global symbol of this problem. Local governments, which had been incentivized to hit GDP growth targets rather than create actual economic value, built to hit their numbers. The debt that financed this investment didn't disappear. China's total debt to GDP ratio rose from roughly 150% in 2008 to over 280% by 2023. The country that had navigated the 2008 financial crisis by injecting the largest stimulus package in history, $586 billion, a figure that made Western bailouts look cautious, had created its own debt mountain in the process. The property sector, which, at peak, accounted for roughly 25 to 30% of Chinese GDP by some measures, began showing systemic cracks with the Evergrande crisis in 2021. A company with $300 billion in liabilities, built on a model of pre-selling apartments that hadn't yet been constructed, began defaulting on its obligations. The contagion spread through the property sector, revealing what economists had quietly suspected, that a significant portion of Chinese household wealth, stored in property values, was built on an asset bubble. Xi Jinping's response to these structural vulnerabilities, cracking down on the tech sector, the education sector, private capital accumulation, asserting party control over previously autonomous market actors, represents a deliberate reversal of some of the liberalizing reforms that generated the growth miracle in the first place. Whether this represents a sustainable long-term model or the beginning of an inflection point is the central question in global economics right now. Here's what the story of China's economic transformation actually teaches, if you're willing to receive it honestly. Growth at extraordinary scale doesn't require ideological purity. It requires pragmatism, brutal enough to override ideology when reality demands it. Deng Xiaoping wasn't a capitalist. He was a survivor who learned that starving people cannot build a powerful state. 18 farmers in Xiaogang weren't economists. They were hungry people who understood incentives better than any party official. The greatest poverty reduction in human history happened not because someone had the perfect model. It happened because enough people with enough desperation were given just enough space to solve their own problems. That is both the most hopeful thing you will hear about economic development, and if you understand what it implies about the conditions that produced it, something that should leave you unsettled. Because the same forces that built China's miracle, the pressure of mass poverty, the urgency of a government that needed growth to maintain legitimacy, the temporary alignment of cheap labor and global demand, are not replicable by design. They were conditions of a specific historical moment, one that has passed. The question that nobody has answered yet, the one that will define the next 50 years of global economics, is what happens when an economy built on the velocity of transformation starts to slow down, when the fishing villages are already cities, when the rural workers have already migrated, when the wages that made Chinese manufacturing competitive have risen enough that the competitive advantage has shifted, what comes next is not something China's past can tell you. History always stops exactly where the next question begins. If this changed how you see the world's biggest economic story, subscribe. Every week, we go somewhere that most people won't. History has the answers. The question is whether you're willing to look at the parts that make you uncomfortable.